Chapter 5. By late that evening, the search party hadn't found any sign of Amber and Frisbee. Dora phoned the Animal Ark after the police had returned to Psyche Farm, drenched and shivering, saying it was too dark to keep looking. They promised to be back with the Moreland Rescue Team as soon as it gets light, she told Mandy, as long as the weather doesn't get any worse. As long as the weather doesn't get any worse, Mandy echoed silently. But what if it did? Amber and Frisbee would never survive outdoors in the conditions like this. They must go back to the barn tonight, she said. I've left the thermos of hot chocolate in case she does, says Doris, speaking quickly as if she didn't want to admit to her kindness. Mandy could hardly sleep that night. She tossed and turned, listening to the rain pelting her window. All she could think about was the girl and the tiny puppy alone in the dark and bleak weather. When gray fingers of the dawn began creeping through the gap in the curtains, Mandy sprang out of the bed and ran downstairs, 2 steps at a time, to phone Dora. Are the sandwiches and hot chocolate gone? She asked, gripping the receiver so tightly that her fingers hurt. No, came the curt reply. Mandy's heart sank. So they have been out all night. We can't be sure of that, said Dora. They could have come back to the barn with food of their own. Amber dropped the puppy food. Mandy reminded her Frisbee must be starving by now. You're jumping to conclusions, Mandy. That girl's not going to let the puppy starve, said Dora. She must have some sense in her head. Mandy didn't agree. If Amber had any sense, she wouldn't have run off with Frisbee in the first place. She thanked Dora, hung up the phone, then flopped down in a chair and stared gloomily at the floor. Coming for breakfast, Mandy? Called her dad from the kitchen. I'm not hungry, Mandy stated, but she was interrupted by the phone. She grabbed it, convinced it was going to be Dora again, and good news. Have you found them? She said breathlessly. Found who? It's James. Oh, you mean Amber and Frisbee? I haven't been looking for them. Actually, I was calling to see if you'd heard anything yet. When Mandy and her dad had come in last night, she'd called James to bring him back. Like Mandy, he hated the thought of missing the girl and the puppy. Sorry, Mandy said. I thought you were Dora. And no, there's no good news yet. She looked out the window. It was still raining, but the sky was definitely lighter and the clouds higher. A full-scale search had to be possible this morning. But why leave it only to the professionals? The more people looking for Amber and Frisbee, the better. Mandy came to the decision. Can you be here in 15 minutes? Sure, why, said James. Because we're forming our own search party, Mandy replied. We are? James sounded a bit surprised. Okay, I'll bring Blackie and we'll pick up the scent. We'll see, muttered Mandy. If Dora's highly trained dog hadn't been able to track Amber and Frisbee, there wasn't much hope that Blackie would be able to either. Mandy had ever known he would be helped, but he'd enjoy being out more for a run. Who knows, Mandy said to James. Frisbee might be happy to see another dog when we find him and Amber. If we find them, said James. Don't be negative, said Mandy. She put the phone down and ran upstairs to dress. 5 minutes later, she appeared in the kitchen. Dr. Amber was pulling on his white coat, ready for morning clinic hours. Going on an Arctic expedition, he asked, surprised to see her wearing a bright red ski suit. Mandy managed a smile. Not unless you call the moors the Arctic. She rippled about in a heap of laundry that had just come out of the dryer and found a pair of thick thermal socks. This is the only really bright outfit I own. I will help us stand out in the moors if we need help, and it's definitely warm. Ah, said Dr. Adam, raising his eyebrows. Mandy, you know the Moreland Rescue Team will be out there searching for Amber and Frisbee this morning. If they can't find them, well, he stopped and shrugged. Why am I trying to argue with you? You'd think I'd learned more by now than to waste my breath trying to argue with you and change your mind. Mandy nodded. Promise me one thing, said Dr. Adam, that you'll be careful. Mandy nodded again. and that you'll come back when the weather gets worse, added Dr. Emily, who was loading the dishwasher. Yes, yes, Mandy said impatiently. She looked out the window to see if there was any sign of James, even though she knew he'd never have gotten to the animal ark so quickly. And that you'll call us if you see any trouble, Dr. Adam handed Mandy his cell phone. Will do, Mandy promised. How are you planning to get to Dora's farm? Asked Dr. Adam. Mandy fiddled with a pair of socks in her hands. I thought that we might need to have her hoof checked this morning. Nice try, Mandy, said her mom. Actually, Dr. Emily sounded reluctant, but she went on. I do not have to go out to see a sick mare this morning. Not for Dora's farm.
I mean it though. When I say that you're not going too far off the beaten track, you know how dangerous it is to be on the moors. Thanks, Mom. I promise we'll be careful. Mandy hugged Dr. Emily, who was opening a large envelope. Are those the results of Portia's blood test? The wording on the back flap of the envelope read, McClurg and Burroughs Pathology. Looks like it, said Dr. Emily. She took out the report and she and her husband studied it in silence. What does it say? Asked Mandy, somehow both wanting yet not wanting to know the results. A diagnosis for Portia was vital, but she couldn't bear it if it turned out to be something extremely serious. All the tests are negative, announced Dr. Adam. It looks like we're back to square one. Mandy's expression fell. But how can they all be negative when Portia's definitely sick? It could be something that doesn't show up in the types of tests we ordered, explained her mom. We're going to have to put on our thinking caps again. Mandy bit her lip, knowing that the time was running out. Her dad's words echoed in her head again. They don't generally show signs of being sick until the illness is at fairly advanced stage. Dr. Adam picked up the report and glanced through it. Again, it's probably something completely obvious that's staring us in the face. Then we have to stare back much harder until we see it, Mandy said with determination. When Mandy and her mom and James and Blackie arrived at Dora's farm 45 minutes later, there were a number of other vehicles already parked in the yard. A blue and white police car stood next to two Land Rovers, one blue and the other dark green. Oh, good, Mandy said with relief. The rescue team's already here. She could see them in the distance, moving in the line across the moor behind the farm. In the mist and drizzle, they looked like ghosts. In happier circumstances, this might have made Mandy smile. After all, it was almost Halloween, but right now, trick-or-treating was the last thing on her mind. Watching the rescue team reminded Mandy of the time James had been lost in the Scottish Highlands. He'd fallen down a crevice on his way to get help for a stallion who was trapped at the bottom of a deep ditch. But he was quickly found thanks to a dog rescue named Moss. It's a pity Moss is so far away. We could use a dog like that now. Mandy mused as she climbed out of the Animal Ark Land Rover. James jumped down from the back seat with Blackie. He looked at Mandy with a hurt expression. I bet if Blackie was trained, he'd make an awesome search dog. Of course he would, Mandy agreed, although privately she thought it would take a lot of training. Blackie was adorable, but he wasn't famous for being super obedient. She gave the Labrador an affectionate pat. Dora came out of the farmhouse then. She seemed surprised to see Mandy and her mom and James. No news yet, I'm afraid, she told them. James and I have come to help, Mandy said, pulling on her gloves. Dora looked at them doubtfully. I don't know about that. I'm sure the team has all the manpower they need. 10 in all. 2 police officers, and 8 people from the Moreland Search and Rescue Service. The more people out looking, the better, remarked James. He kneeled down on one knee to tie a shoelace. Like Mandy, he was wearing hiking boots with thick rubber soles. He also had on a bulky parka that made him look twice his normal size. Could be, said Dora, but you need time to catch up with them. They started out nearly an hour ago. We're not thinking of catching up to them, Mandy explained. We're going to do our own search in a different area. One that's safe and clearly marked, emphasized Dr. Emily. Dora exchanged a glance with Emily Hope and shrugged. It looks like we won't change their minds, she said. Well, I can think of a way to help you avoid getting lost. One girl and a puppy in danger on my property is more than enough. She turned around and pointed to the crumbling stone wall snaking across the undulated moor. See that wall? Mandy nodded. There's an old path running next to it for a couple of miles, said Dora. The rescuers plan to get there late this afternoon, but I suppose it won't hurt if you two scout around there now. It looks safe enough, said James. He brought along a pair of binoculars and was studying the path through them. You'll be fine as long as you stay on the path and turn back if the weather gets worse, cautioned Dora. Dr. Emily nodded in agreement. It makes sense to stick to a clear path, and looked at her watch. It's 9 o'clock now. I'll be there for an hour and a half. Let's meet back here at 10:30. She was about to get into the Land Rover, but she stopped to give Mandy a hug. You will be careful, won't you, honey? Of course, Mandy said. I know I sound like a worry rat, but I can only imagine how desperate Amber's parents must be. Emily said and sighed. The last thing anyone needs now is for you two and Blackie to get lost as well. We won't, James promised. Mandy watched her mom drive away, suddenly feeling nervous. We'll see you in an hour and a half, she said to Dora. Be sure you close the gates behind you and that Blackie doesn't go near the sheep, Dora warned them. Don't worry about him, said James. He took a leash out of his pocket to show Dora that he could restrain Blackie if he had to. Mandy and James set off at a fast pace for the old path, heading into an icy wind that felt as if it had come straight from the Arctic. When they came to the path, Mandy crouched down and looked for footprints, but the stony ground didn't reveal any tracks. It looks like we'll have to rely on Blackie's nose, said James, half seriously. I don't think that'll get us very far, Mandy remarked. He doesn't know Amber from a bar of soap, so he's not going to get excited if he picks up her scent. The Labrador had stopped next to a prickly clump of shiberry several yards ahead.
He smells something, James whispered. Mandy had a lot of faith in dogs, but she knew Blackie well. If he found anything at all, it was likely to be something to eat. James paused as Blackie pushed a branch aside to reveal an old sandwich wrapper. False alarm. James picked the paper up and stuffed it in his pocket. Maybe you're right, Mandy. We can't rely on Blackie completely. A few minutes later, Blackie dove into another clump of bushes. He let out a sharp bark of triumph, and Mandy's heart lurched. Had he found some trace of Amber and Frisbee? The two friends sprinted down the path and had almost reached Blackie when a small brown creature shot out in front of them and darted away. Mandy stopped running. Another false alarm, she said gloomily. The terrified rabbit bounced across the moor with Blackie in hot pursuit. Blackie, yelled James, chasing after him. The rabbit scurried down a hole and James managed to reach Blackie before he started trying to dig it out. That's enough, he scolded. We're looking for a girl and a puppy, not bunnies. He tugged the leash, but the Labrador stayed put. Sometimes, James said, feeling in his pocket, you're more stubborn than a mule. He took out a dog biscuit and used it to lure Blackie back to the path. Now, can we please concentrate on finding Amber and Frisbee? They continued along the path, checking behind the wall every now and then to see if Amber was huddled behind it. Amber, Mandy called out several times. It's okay, you're not in trouble. Your mom and dad only want to know that you're safe. But her cries were met with silence. She has to be out here somewhere, said James, scanning the hills with his binoculars. On the horizon, big black clouds were building up once more, and the steady drizzle that had been falling for the past hour was getting heavier. Mandy could just make out the other search party high on the moor across the valley. If she hadn't known what the distant gray shapes were, she'd mistaken them for rocks or shrubs. There's nothing here, Mandy sighed, not even a candy wrapper. It seemed as if Amber and Frisbee had vanished into thin air, leaving only a blanket and a half-eaten packet of puppy food. She looked at her watch. It was nearly 10 o'clock. We'll have to start back, she told James reluctantly. Okay, he was studying the moor and one last time through his binoculars. Let's hope the others have better luck, he whistled to Blackie, who was sniffing at another hole, probably in the hope of scaring out another rabbit. Come on, boy, we're going home. Blackie ignored him. Blackie, repeated James. At that moment, Mandy glimpsed a second rabbit crouched next to a bush not far from the Labrador. Please don't move, she willed the little animal. Another chase across the moor would delay them even more. But the creature's flight reflex kicked in and it darted off like a little brown missile. Blackie charged across the moor behind it, his ears flapping in the wind and his tail stretched out. Blackie, shouted James, racing after him. The rabbit ran up a short hill and vanished down a hole near the top. But Blackie thundered right past. Either he hadn't seen the hole or he was in the trail of something else. Now what? James puffed, running faster. Ahead of him, Blackie paused to sniff the ground before disappearing down the other side of the slope. Mandy caught up with James just as he reached the top of the hill. They stopped to catch their breath and watched Blackie running at full speed across the moor. He was heading in a straight line toward a tumble-down stone shed half hidden by a grove of trees. Maybe there, Mandy started to say, just as James said, you don't think... Understanding each other perfectly, the two friends raced down the hill. It's probably just another rabbit, Mandy said, panting. Running too fast to speak, James nodded. Blackie stopped near the building then and started to sniff around the walls. Seen close up, the building was even more run down than Mandy had first thought. The walls were crumbling and most of the slate roof had fallen in. A wooden door hung on one hinge and swung back and forth in the wind. It must be about as sheltered in there as it is outside, Mandy remarked, raising her voice above the howling wind. Let's look inside anyway, suggested James. Okay, but hold on to Blackie in case he was after another rabbit, Mandy warned. She heaved the door open and slipped inside. She paused, waiting for her eyes to adjust to the darkness. There was a smell of damp earth and mold, and the stone floor was scattered with old straw. James and Blackie squeezed in behind her. It's not exactly the most welcoming sort of place, remarked James. An icy draft whistled around Mandy as she took a few steps forward, so she could just make out a pile of old hay bales heaped in a corner. But that wasn't all. What's that? She whispered. At the bottom of the stack was a long, low lump, just about the size and shape of a sleeping person. Mandy caught her breath. It was a person. There was a girl curled up, fast asleep on the hay-strewn floor. She was wearing a blue jacket and clutching a large backpack in her arms. Her long dark hair fell over her cheek, and her fingers looked very white against the navy blue fabric of the rucksack. Mandy knelt down to get a closer look and saw that the flap of the backpack was twitching. Carefully, she lifted it up. Oh, she whispered when a little face popped out, a sweet brown and white face framed by soft, drooping brown ears. The face of a beagle puppy. It's Amber and Frisbee, Mandy said softly.
Chapter 6. The puppy stretched his neck and licked Mandy's hand. His tiny pink tongue felt warm and velvety. Then he whittled out of the backpack and into Mandy's outstretched arms. You're absolutely gorgeous, she said, cuddling him. She spoke quietly, not wanting to wake Amber. Can you believe it? She whispered to James, who was smiling from ear to ear. I knew Blackie would find them, he murmured, proudly patting his dog. Mandy had her arms wrapped around the puppy so that he was hidden from Blackie's view. But the Labrador's sharp nose had picked up Frisbee's scent and he was sniffing the air curiously. Mandy held the beagle up in front of her to get a good look at him. He looks like he's in good shape, James observed. Amber obviously been taking good care of him. Mandy hardly heard him. She was staring in horror at the beagle. But look at his eyes, James, she gasped. An ugly pink lump about the size of a marble filled the inside corner of the puppy's right eye. It looked both painful and awkward. Mandy couldn't remember seeing anything like it before. Mandy's shocked outburst woke Amber up. What do you want? She cried, sitting up. She saw Frisbee in Mandy's arms. Give him to me. He's mine, she shouted, and before Mandy knew it, Amber had grabbed the puppy and was scrambling to her feet. It's okay, Mandy said, standing up too. We want to help you. She glanced at the puppy's painful-looking eye and added, and Frisbee. We don't need any help, Amber insisted, and she covered the puppy's face with one hand. Just leave us alone. She looked very pale, and Mandy saw that her fingers were shaking. Her hair was lank and dirty, and there was a grubby mark on her cheek from where she'd been laying on the rotten straw. She obviously watched over Frisbee, but hadn't taken care of herself at all. Blackie jumped up at Frisbee, wagging his tail. "Whoa, boy," James said, gripping Blackie's collar with both hands. Amber backed up against the hay and clutched the beetle closer. "Keep that dog away. I don't want him to hurt Frisbee." "Don't worry. Blackie wouldn't hurt a puppy," James assured her. "He only wants to say hello," he added. "Well, he can't," said Amber, edging farther away. "He might hurt Frisbee's eye." Mandy quietly ended the sentence for her. Amber said nothing. She half turned as if shielding Frisbee. "Just leave us alone," she murmured. "Please." Frisbee wriggled in her arms. She petted him and whispered something in his velvety, floppy ear. Then she lifted the flap of the backpack and gently put Frisbee inside so that only his head was visible. Seeing him peeping out in that way reminded Mandy of something she once read about beetles. That hunters in the 18th century used to work with tiny beetles who fit inside their hunting coat pockets. "He's a pocket beetle," Mandy said with a smile. "What do you mean?" Amber demanded, shooting Mandy a worried look. "It's a name given to very small beetles," Mandy explained. "But Frisbee is not small for his age," Amber blurted out. "His brothers and sisters were exactly the same size. There's nothing wrong with him." "I think there is," Jim replied, "but it's not his size, it's his eye." His bluntness made Amber even more defensive. "He's fine," she protested. But Mandy could tell by the catch in her voice that Amber didn't really believe this. "Look, Amber," Mandy said, "everyone's worried about you. Your mom's been on TV begging you to come home." Amber looked amazed. "Really?" "She just wants to know you're safe," added James. "Well, I am," said Amber. "No one knows that yet except for us, and you must realize that Frisbee needs to get to a vet soon," Mandy pointed out. The puppy blinked at Mandy as if he was agreeing with her. "There's a moorland search and rescue team close by with the police," said James. "They'll be able to take you home right away." "The police?" Amber tightened her grip on the backpack. Frisbee shook his ears with a flap as if he didn't want to be squished. "Am I in trouble?" Amber whispered. "No, they're just out looking for you," James told her. "I can run and tell them we found you while you go to the farmhouse with Mandy to wait for her mom. Dr. Emily's a vet." The mention of a vet seemed to upset Amber even more than news of the police looking for her. "We can't go to the vet," she sobbed, tears welling up in her eyes. "I won't let anyone put Frisbee to sleep." And without another word, she raced over to the door and slipped outside. "Wait," Mandy cried. She started to run after her just as Blackie yanked himself free from James, who toppled over on the slippery straw. The leash slipped out of James' hands and Blackie bounded forward straight into Mandy's legs. "Oof," she gasped, losing her balance and crashing onto the stack of bales. Luckily, James' year of practice catching Blackie had prepared him. Though he was sprawled out on his stomach, he managed to grab the end of the leash before Blackie could charge away. "Got you," he said, springing to his feet. Mandy was up in a flash too. "We have to stop Amber," she shouted and ran outside to find that the big black clouds had finally burst. Raindrops streamed from the sky like a thick gray curtain. "Come on, James," Mandy urged, shielding her eyes against the rain to gaze across the field behind the shed. Amber was a surprisingly fast runner, and she was already clambering over a wall far ahead. With Blackie racing at the end of his leash, they rushed after her. "Stop," Mandy yelled. "We only want to help you." But either her voice was swallowed up by the rain and wind, or Amber was deliberately ignoring her, because the girl ahead of them started running again after she cleared the wall. "We'll never catch her," Mandy puffed. She lengthened her stride as Amber scrambled over another wall and began to race up the rocky land of the open moor. Then Mandy blinked. Amber had vanished. It was as if she'd been plucked off the moor and spirited away. "Where did she go?" James yelled above the wind. He held up his free hand to push the wet hair out of his eyes, but his glasses were so wet with raindrops that Mandy doubted he could see any better. They reached the wall at the end of the field and hoisted themselves over. Blackie cleared it with an enormous leap that almost wrenched James' arms out of its socket. They ran on up the hill until they came to the point where Amber and Frisbee had disappeared. Mandy looked around. Amber couldn't have dived behind a rock or clump of bushes. Apart from a few flat boulders, the bleak, soggy landscape was empty. "How can someone just evaporate?" said James. He took off his glasses and wiped them on the hem of his jacket. Clean glasses or not, there was still no sign of Amber when he put them on again. Blackie was just as confused. He turned around and around, his broad black face creased in a frown. Mandy was about to suggest that James let him go. He led them to the runaways once before, he could probably do it again. And then, above the wind, came a faint cry. Help! It was Amber. It sounded like she was a long way away. The chase across the moor had left Mandy feeling hot inside her ski suit, but a cold shiver ran through her as Amber cried out again. "Help me, please!" "This is really weird," whispered James, staring around them at the empty moor. Mandy guessed he was thinking about Halloween and unexplained supernatural phenomenon. "Help! Someone help!" The desperate plea seemed to swim up from the ground, muffled yet echoing like someone calling from under the sea.
"Where are you?" Mandy yelled, as loud as she could. "Over here," came the distant reply. James scratched his head. "It's crazy. She sounds so near and far away." It was like a riddle, but one that Mandy knew had to be solved fast. "Where's here?" Mandy shouted again. They listened hard for the reply. "Down here." That meant Amber was either at the bottom of the hill, but Mandy could see for miles around, and there was no sign of a girl or a puppy in a backpack, or she was underground. James slowly walked on again, with Blakey leaping and squirming at the end of the leash like a fish on a line. Suddenly he stopped. "Look," he said, pointing to a rock in front of him. Mandy ran over. Almost hidden by the rock was a jagged black hole about the size of a foxhole. Her hands flew up to her mouth. Amber was underground. Mandy hadn't seen many potholes before, but she knew that the entrance to underground caves were dotted all over the moor. They were often fenced off by farmers who were worried about losing sheep. If Amber had really fallen into one, she could be in big, big trouble. "I hope it's not too deep," said James, echoing Mandy's thoughts. He knelt down and peered into the darkness. "Amber, are you okay?" "I think so," came Amber's muted voice. "And Frisbee." Mandy braced herself for the reply. There was another pause. Mandy bit her lip as she imagined the worst, like Amber landing on top of Frisbee in the backpack, crushing him beneath her, or Frisbee being flung out and crashing into the rocks. At best, he'd be cut and bruised and very frightened. She exchanged a worried glance with James. "He's fine." Mandy almost fell over with relief. "The backpack must have protected him," Amber continued. Mandy remembered that the backpack was thick padded. It probably contained a few items of clothing that would have added the padding. "Can you climb out?" she called to Amber. She looked down, hoping to see her, but all she could see was a narrow tunnel stopping down at an angle and surrounded by steep, rocky walls. "I'll try." There was another pause. Then Amber said, "Oh, my ankle. I think it's sprained." This was all they needed. Mandy thought fast. Dad's phone, she remembered, and reached into her pocket. It was there. She struck her forehead with her hand. "I can't believe it," she told James. "I left it at home." There was only one option. "You've got to go for help, James. I'm going to go down and see if I can help Amber." "You can't do that," James protested, his face white under his dripping hair. "It's too dangerous." Mandy looked back at him. "Imagine how Amber must be feeling," she said quietly so that Amber wouldn't hear her. "She needs company more than anything else. And don't forget Frisbee. He might be scared, and his eye must be hurting too. I can help by keeping him calm." She pushed James' arm. "Now go on, run." Before James could say anything else, Mandy wriggled into the hole and clung to the edge while her feet searched for the foothold of the walls. "I'm coming down, Amber," she called. "Be careful, Mandy," James said while Blakey whined softly and muzzled Mandy's head. "I'll be fine," Mandy promised, hoping she sounded more confident than she felt. "Now go." "Okay," said James. "I'll be as quick as I can." Mandy listened to the soft thudding on his feet, felt the vibrations on the ground as he ran. Then she braced her feet against the slippery sides of the tunnel and started to inch her way down, her nails scraping against the rocky wall. as she could feel moss and dirt collecting beneath them. The tunnel curved around before plunging straight down, getting narrower all the time. Mandy's heart thudded uncomfortably. It was like going down a funnel. She looked up and saw the tiniest slight of gray sky above her. She was probably only about a yard or so below the surface, but already it felt like she was deep underground. "Are you still okay, Amber?" she called. "Uh-huh." Amber sounded very close now. "But watch out, there's a rock jutting out just behind you." "Thanks," Mandy said, and she felt the rock scrape her back as she lowered herself past it. Her feet touched a hard, flat surface. She'd reached the bottom. "Phew," she said. Amber was sitting on the floor of a small cave with one leg, probably the injured one, stretched out and the other tucked underneath her. She hugged the backpack to her, protecting the precious contents. There was just enough light filtering down the tunnel for Mandy to see around the cave. When she looked back up the way she'd came, she'd realize with a gulp that it was completely sheer and would be hard enough to climb up with the injured ankle. There was no way out now until rescue team arrived. Fighting back the urge to panic, she crouched down next to Amber. "I guess I should introduce myself," said Mandy, trying to make out the expression on Amber's face. "I'm Mandy Hope." "Hi again," the scared-looking girl replied. "I'm Amber." "I know," said Mandy. "Actually, the whole county knows." She could see now that Amber smiled at her joke and looked a little less intimidated. "At least you're both more or less all right," Mandy said. Amber edged to one side of the cave to give Mandy a little more space. There was just enough room for the two of them. There was a small hole in the opposite wall, and when Mandy peered through it, she saw that it was another narrow tunnel. "Not much good going in there. It even more cramped," she murmured, already feeling claustrophobic. "James will be back with help soon," she told Amber. Frisbee must have recognized her voice because he peeped out of the backpack. He squirmed with delight when he saw Mandy and worked his way onto her lap. Amber didn't seem to mind him being friendly to someone else. "Hi again," Mandy smiled, hugged him. "It's good to see you." She tried to sound cheerful, but even to her own ears, her voice seemed strained. The hideous lump is Frisbee's eye. The fall into the pothole seems minor. Amber must have noticed the tension in Mandy's voice. She reached over and petted Frisbee, who had curled up in Mandy's arms. "He's just the best, you know." Mandy nodded but said nothing. She had a feeling Amber was about to tell her a lot more. She had climbed down the pothole to help, and if listening was the best way to do that, then she was all ears. "I adored him the moment I saw him," Amber went on, not taking her eyes off Frisbee's floppy ears. "He was always the first to run to me when I arrived." The puppy rolled over and laid on his back in Mandy's arms. Mandy ran her fingers up and down his little round belly, and Frisbee grunted with pleasure. "He loves that," said Amber. "And chasing balls and digging holes." She gulped, and Mandy realized she was fighting back tears. "I just can't let him be put to sleep," Amber said in a rush before she finally broke down. "It would be like putting my best friend down," she sobbed. Mandy didn't know what to say. Frisbee appeared to the picture of health. Until you saw his eye, she had to admit that the pink tumor looked very serious enough to be inoperable. For once, she couldn't offer any comforting words about the great things her parents could do to help sick animals. Amber put her hands over her face. "We can't let him die." Hot tears burned Mandy's cheeks, too. She shifted Frisbee into the crook of her arm and put the other around Amber's shoulders. "I know how you feel," she murmured. "I've loved so many gorgeous animals, and my mom and dad couldn't help. It's really tough, but I've had to learn sometimes the best thing we can do for an animal who's seriously ill." She trailed off. Amber was silent, waiting for Mandy to finish. "It's to release them from their misery," Mandy whispered. Words bounced around the walls in the cave like a clock striking the hour. With a painful lump in her throat, she kissed the top of Frisbee's head, wondering just how much time he had left. Frisbee stretched luxuriously, then rolled over and scrambled onto Mandy's lap. She wrinkled her fingers in front of him, and he dabbed it with the front paw before he jumped down and started pulling on Amber's shoelaces. "See what I mean? He's got so much energy," said Amber, looking at Mandy again. "It's not like he's in any pain, and that's why I had to take him away." Mandy wasn't sure she followed Amber's drift. "What do you mean?" "The sanctuary was really busy, And when Frisbee and his brothers and sisters were brought in, Linda Davis, the woman who runs the kennels, asked me to be in charge of them, so no one else really got to see them right away, explained Amber, which was good. Mandy was still perplexed. I must have shown on her face because Amber continued. If other people had seen Frisbee's eye, they'd have been called in a vet, and then he'd have been put to sleep by now. She winced as Frinsley attacked her shoe on her injured foot, but she didn't stop him from playing. It seemed she was prepared to suffer anything for him. You can't be sure of that, Mandy argued, wishing she hadn't said anything about animals being put out of her misery. Didn't you think there would be a chance a vet could help Frisbee recover? I couldn't take that chance, said Amber. One of my friends had a puppy with eye cancer. As soon as the vet knew there was a problem, he put the puppy down. I wanted Frisbee to have a chance at life. Mandy finally understood why Amber had run away. Who wouldn't want such a lovely, adorable puppy to live? You're right, she said, wenching her words out from somewhere deep inside.